That's perfect. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ibrahim Olabi. Ibrahim is a lawyer at Guernica 37, International Justice Chambers in the UK, and is the founder of the Syrian Legal Development Program, SLDP, an NGO that works on human rights issues in Syria since 2014. SLDP provides legal capacity building into Syrian NGOs, as well as working on human rights and business issues linked to the conflict. Through SLDP, Ibrahim has conducted human rights work in Syria, near the front lines, and advocated with policymakers and heads of states around many capitals. He has trained hundreds of Syrians, including victims, on complex legal matters relevant to torture, forced displacement, and chemical weapons. Ibrahim also consulted for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute on Syria-related matters. He's made appearances on BBC and CNN, and today he's appearing here with us. Ibrahim.
Two very difficult performances to follow. One that shook my inner soul with her words, and the other one with his tunes. And I'm expected now to deliver a 15-minute speech. But let's give it a go. Usually, when we're invited to talk about Syria, it's a sad situation. It is not a happy occasion. But the reason, or one of the reasons why I agreed to come and speak today, and agreed is not out of ego, but it was because I had just a newborn, and so to get into trouble with my wife to come here, is because this is a happy occasion. For a change, we're meeting here today on a Saturday morning with a lot of young faces, and I appreciate how difficult that is given that it was Friday night and Halloween yesterday, so there's a lot of pressure mounting, to celebrate a human rights defender with a full house. And when Ruba was talking about what you can do, you've already done something today. You've attended, and you've sent a message. Human rights and defending human rights don't get caused by humanitarian disasters. The people that Ruba and her organization are working for, they did not flee because of volcanoes and earthquakes. Probably that's the only thing left in Syria to take place. But they fled because there are politicians who are committing human rights abuses. And this morning, you've all sent them a message. That at a time where human rights defenders are being defamed, they're being targeted, they're being discredited, they're being attacked, Bergen says no. Bergen says we're here to celebrate those who defend human rights. And that is a political message that you're sending today. So I thank you. Now, delivering this speech is a little slightly challenging. One, because as I said, it's a happy occasion, and therefore I don't want to depress you about Syria and try to keep the positive spirit, which is a difficult situation. But also I'm somehow supposed to sum up 8 years in about 8 minutes. I'm a lawyer, I suck at math, it's not my thing. But I try to somehow come up with very short yes and no statements about Syria. Hopefully that will all, kind of try to get the information forward. And I've chosen 11 yes and no statements. And 11 is not an arbitrary number. It does answer a lot of my security questions. Because 2011 is a date that every Syrian remembers. It is the date that some of you might think we hate, because it's the start of the Syrian conflict, or it's the start of brutality. But if you ask the majority of Syrians, they'll tell you 2011 is a date they'll treasure forever. And so I'll take you through these 11 yes and no statements quickly. So yes, there is a conflict in Syria. But no, the conflict did not start in 2011. What started in 2011 is a peaceful uprising like the one we see in Lebanon today, asking for the most basic of political and human rights. The conflict, the armed conflict, started about 2012, when the Syrian army started shooting on the protesters, on those who demanded their rights. Some of those fighters defected from the army and started shooting back, and that's when the Syrian conflict started. And I know for journalists and media, it's difficult to figure out one word to say what started from 2011, but I myself say no. The Syrian conflict did not start in 2011. What started in 2011 was a peaceful, beautiful uprising against dictatorship. And yes, civilians are killed in Syria. Hospitals are destroyed. Refugees are fleeing. But make no mistake, because no, these civilians are not a result of war. They're not killed as a result of collateral damage. They are specifically targeted. You cannot incidentally cause rape. You cannot incidentally torture 14,000 people and summary execute them in regime cells like Amnesty reported. When the UN Commission of Inquiry interviewed 504 Syrian women about rape in regime cells, that cannot be a result of war. That is a result of persecution. So make no mistake by conflating the two. And yes, everyone is talking about a political solution for Syria. But no, Syria is not a political problem. When you say the word political problem in the UK, the first thing that comes to your mind is Brexit, elections, Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats. But that's not why 400,000 civilians lost their lives. They lost it because they were particularly targeted. So Syria is not a political problem in the normal sense. It's not opposition and regime and meetings in Geneva. Yes, that's part of the process. But it's a human rights problem. And yes, there is a civil war in Syria. I used to hate using this term up until 2016. But no, it's not just a civil war. It's a proxy war. It involves the US, it involves Russia, it involves Turkey, it involves Iran, it involves Saudi, it involves the UK, it involves Europe. Almost every country is in one way or other involved in Syria. And that might seem like a depressing fact, but it's also an opportunity, because where one state is present, another state could be present. And when it is difficult to achieve things on a domestic level, perhaps the international community could step up its game. Yes, absolutely you should question and be critical of mainstream media. We've seen issues in the past. I'm not going to use Trump's words of how he describes the media, but yes, we should be critical of mainstream media, but on the other hand, not believe everything with the alternative media, Russia Today, or what we read by average Joe on social media. I was told he's called Olna Norman in Norway. So whatever Olna Norman says on Syria, it's not strictly true. Even those who say, because Syria, there's a lot of propaganda and disinformation going on, that say that I've been to Syria, and therefore that somehow gives them the legitimacy to talk about everything that's happening in Syria. Question, where have they been? What have they reported? You cannot go to government-held areas and discredit crimes in opposition-held areas in the same way that you cannot visit opposition-held areas and discredit crimes that took place in regime-held areas. See, I'm not sure if this is counting down or counting up, but I'm just going to keep going. Yes, Syria was a beautiful country that you may have visited, your friends, it's beautiful, it's culture, but that's not the Syria we saw. So no, beyond this culture, behind these nice buildings and walls and stone, probably a few meters below the ground, there are people being tortured. We saw Syria as a police state, as a dictatorship. And so when politicians come out and say, by probably a speech written by their intern, no offense to their intern, and say, we want to give Syrians back the life they had, we say no thanks. We don't want to get the Syria we had. We want a better Syria. It's not about water and electricity and stone and these very nice window dressings, cosmetics. Yes, it's important, it's part of our heritage, but there is far more to Syria than the stone. There are the people. And so, no, you might see a lot of companies trying, but they're actually trying to advertise tourism now to Syria. I've seen 2 French tourism companies that take you to certain specific areas, all on your own with about 60 military vans around you to see the things that they want you to see, to say, look, Syria is safe. Yes, refugees fled Syria. But no, most of them did not flee war. They fled persecution. And while war might end by a reduction of bombings and shellings, persecution does not. Persecution is about torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, all acts that are caused by those who still remain in power in Syria. Yes, many European states want refugees to return. And yes, a lot of refugees do want to return. But no, the conditions are not there yet. Syria is not safe. Refugees are being used as a bargaining chip by different political powers involved in Syria in order for them to say, return refugees, that will trigger reconstruction funding, all the Russian companies and Iranian companies will start making their money off that. They're all being used as a political tool. Please do not fall into that trap. And yes, state sovereignty is important, but not when it comes at the cost of the state being the primary perpetrator in Syria. By no means is the state the only perpetrator. Almost all parties to the conflict committed crimes. That is not something that we can shy away from. But to equate and conflate the numbers risks us harming the narrative, not being able to talk about transitional justice, not being able to address the victims' needs when we say and hide behind all parties to the conflict committed crimes. Because the numbers are nowhere near proportionate. And yes, war crimes in Syria are very well documented. But no, there hasn't been any political power or any political will to hold these perpetrators to account. Yes, you might have heard that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed a few days ago, the leader of ISIS. And yes, ISIS was responsible for the most horrendous crimes. But the main perpetrator is still there. And in fact, they're being re-legitimized as a partner of the international community, as a partner in reconstruction, as we speak. It is absolutely fine not to know who to support in Syria. That is okay. I don't know who to support in Syria. There's too many groups, too many factions, too many ideas, too many options. But in my opinion, it is a crime not to know who to oppose. And these are very two different things. I've been working on Syria for the last 6-7 years. I've been to the front lines. I've had to conduct the most difficult interviews with victims of torture and rape. I've seen firsthand what a barrel bomb looks like when it explodes. I still suffer until now when something gets dropped in the kitchen or there's a helicopter flying. I still, to this very day, have to check when I'm in Norway whether this plane is a civilian aircraft or a military aircraft. So yes, The work on Syria has been depressing. It's difficult, it's emotional. We lost many, many friends. We lost many family members. But no, we will not give up hope. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Now we'll move over to the panel session, and I'll ask Musha, Ibrahim, Zaina to join me on stage.
Hi again.
Hi. Welcome.
It's been a while.
How does it feel? Are we comfortable?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Are we ready for the people's vote?
We love the people's vote.
Yes. Yes. We are obliged to.
That word means something completely different in the UK. When you say the people's, just saying, it's not acceptable.
So yes, okay. Let's see. What is this? Oh, here we. This is how it's going. Yes, and we also have technology that makes us able to see it here. Yeah. What comes after the Syrian war? Let's just say that we'll start with the question you voted for here, but you can continue to vote throughout the session. So this can be quite. So if you want us to take another question afterwards, keep on pushing your cell phones. So, but to this question here, what comes after the Syrian war? What can happen with the people living as refugees, and how can the world community secure their rights? It's a very focused question. How would anyone like to give it a try?
Maybe I can just begin with a reflection from Norway, because the UN Special Envoy to Syria now is Norwegian, and I'm very afraid because there's a tendency sometimes in the Norwegian media to make like superheroes of like Norwegian diplomats, and in the recent breakthrough, or they called it breakthrough, and they actually, one of the newspapers I read, they called him the super diplomat, Geir Pedersen. After they started up this constitution committee, or declared that there is now a constitution committee working on a new constitution for Syria. So this is something that is absolutely not bringing any peace or hope, I think, for many Syrians, because it has never been, the constitution has never been the issue for Syria. So I'm just like, I'm very anxious that sometimes with these like big headlines and news, especially that the military operations might have come to an end soon, that we might hear, there is a breakthrough happening, that the opposition and the regime are sitting together in Geneva, signing documents. But as long as this peace does not guarantee the rights for all Syrians, and as long as the regime is still in power, which is the main barrier why many Syrians are not coming back, then I'm afraid this would not be peace. It might be stability, but it might not be the peace that we are looking for.
Yeah. Musha?
I don't disagree with Zaina, but I also think the Constitution is an opportunity to negotiate certain levels of justice for victims, if negotiated correctly. I know we see it as maybe an act or something that is manipulated by the different governments who are involved in the process, and I agree with that. But I also think that we've reached a level in the 8 years of conflict where we do need to seek those different innovative ways of reaching some sort of the maximum level of justice that we can get for victims. And in a lot of cases around the world, actually the Constitution has been one of the ways to guarantee some levels of justice. And I think if negotiated correctly, and if we include some measures for transitional justice, then it could be possible. So I'm not unhopeful, but we take everything with a grain of salt in Syria now, because things changed overnight.
Ibrahim, what comes after the war?
I'm terrified what comes after the war, but not what happens with Syria, but what happens in the next war, wherever it might be. Because if we allowed the kind of crimes to continue that what happened in Syria and go with impunity for perpetrators, yes, Syria is a nice country somewhere in the Middle East, and it's beautiful and all of that. But when Russia, particularly, or the regime, they break international laws, they're not sending a message to Syrians. Syrians have never heard of international laws, a lot under the kind of local education. But they're sending a message to Norway, to the UK, to the US, that I can break the Geneva Conventions, that you are party to, and I can get away with it without you doing anything about it. So what comes after the Syrian war, if justice is not served, and if people are not held accountable, then God forbid how the next war would look like. But in terms of what will happen with Syria, I'm very happy that I don't gamble because honestly, almost every bet I would have put down of what will happen in Syria would probably went completely the opposite way. I think it's impossible to predict. It's impossible to predict what would happen. In Syria, there are too many variables, too many realities, too many scenarios. But what we would like to happen is a different story, and I think what we would like to happen should influence what could happen in Syria. I think asking a question like that, we're not talking about the past. We're talking about something that is currently happening. And so what comes after the Syrian war is really determined by what we do today, what states do today, what concerned citizens such as yourself do today. And before I hand back over to you, I think, I want to pick up on two things that I'm sure are, done by Rafto on purpose. One, that you exercised your right to vote today, which is something Syrians would have been terrified of. And so don't take it for granted, because at least 150 of you have. This voting turnout is not acceptable.
True.
And this shows how much we need to be active within our domestic politics, how much we have a say in order to put the politicians and hold them to account in order to be able to say what will happen for the Syrian war.
Yeah. And in terms of how can a world community secure the rights of the people living as refugees?
Give them the choice. What can happen with people living as refugees is for them to decide. It's not for us to decide. Those of them who want to come back should be allowed to do so. Those of them who want to stay and contribute, respecting local cultures and respecting local laws, should be allowed to do so. I don't believe that there's something called the world community, personally. I mean, I work in international law, and so it's a bit skeptic there. But I think every state should do what it can to give refugees a genuine choice, not the choice that you've highlighted Lebanon is giving to refugees.
So if we, and by the way, it's possible to increase the voter turnout as we go along here. So that's an encouragement from Ibrahim here. So if we go to let's see on the poll here, we're sort of moving into that, and on what kind of change is required by the world community, and in terms of, when we look at how the world community or policymakers or just citizens of different nations, how we deal with the rights of refugees, what can be done?
I think I could just reflect back or connected to the first question, and I think I think Ibrahim said enough already about asking the refugees and giving them the choice. But I think when it comes to Syria in particular, again, we have to be very conscious to the idea of, as long as we don't have justice, and as long as, so I agree with both speakers, as long as justice is not served for the victims and the survivors and their families, then there will not be any peace in Syria. And on the EU or the international community, I mean, it's a big recommendation. I don't know how much they will be able to take this, or if they're listening anyway, but they're like this short-sighted politics of always supporting and favoring stability over human rights. and over justice. I think it's very alarming, it's very dangerous, not only for the region, but as Ibrahim said, for the world, like supporting Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Sisi in Egypt, all different, dictators in the region because they are afraid to face the consequences right now, but they're just like pushing these consequences maybe for 4 or 5 years later until I don't know, a new cycle of violence, of unrest erupts. So this security over human rights, I think, is a very dangerous policy that unfortunately we are bearing the brunt of in Syria and in the Middle East.
Nusha, any comment?
Not really. I mean, I think they both said it, but I think I'm looking at this, what kind of change is required by the world community. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think Ibrahim said it very well, and I think that it's very alarming. And I think also for us and everyone in this room as human rights defenders and activists, I think something we probably all go through is waking up in the morning and saying, what is this movement I'm a part of, or what is this field I'm working tirelessly to promote? Or when you talk about breaching all these international laws and nobody holding anybody responsible, it's really alarming. And I think it's alarming also that as victims of conflicts today, maybe the thing that, even in Syria, from my own work I've seen is people care more, victims are looking more towards acknowledgement of their pain and their suffering, and rather than criminal prosecution, in my opinion. Is because also they've given up a lot of hope in the international community and their ability to hold people to those standards. And as the international community, I think that's something really disappointing, and I think it's something we need to think about where we are in the world today.
I'd like to pick up on what Nusha has said about this idea of acknowledgement. And just to pick up a practical point of what kind of change is required. And I think in one way, the world has changed in the way we're dealing with information, right? So I think in the context of Syria, we're not dealing with a situation where the perpetrators are trying to hide their crimes. They're overflowing the system. They're injecting fake news into it. And I think this is something that we can do. This is something that we can work on. Not seeing Syria as one line, as just a conflict or a war, being able to look beyond that. I think disinformation campaigns, and again, it is not a Syrian phenomena. It is something that we've seen with Trump, it's something that we've seen with Brexit, it's something that we've seen with a lot of groups paying, Facebook now is under investigation over and over again, for political advertisement. There's a lot of that. And a lot of these tools, the bots, the social media accounts, all of that are being used in the Syrian context in order to be able to disinform, take away the narrative from the victims so that, when you're asked about Syria, instead of knowing what's happening, you'll say, it's too complicated, it's too confused. You start doubting legitimate groups that are doing excellent humanitarian work. Every time, I used to personally go to the comment section on every video to see the people's views or, hear of how people are holding them to account. They're no longer the place to go because the amount of bots and likes and counter likes and all this technology that's being put into it, you're actually seeing a state view projected in the voice of community or the fake community. So the change that we need to have on the world community and the citizens, and this is something that all of you control with a click with your phone, is to be able to adapt to this change, change in data and information and disinformation and knowledge management in order not to let perpetrators get away with their crimes.
Thanks.
And I managed to get 20 extra people to vote. So.
Yeah, we're watching it here. That's great.
I should run for.
So let's see here. What's up on? So if we have, what are the biggest challenges for people living as refugees? How can you solve them? Nusha, you've been talking a bit about this already.
Yeah, and I think everybody's been talking about it today. I think it's, education, but I think also having the communities that they're part of see them as willing and capable members of society. I think it's one thing to put refugees in a camp and educate them and give them access to health, and it's another to empower them. And I think that this is a really important need that is a lot of time neglected because, yeah, we see the first as the basic needs, which is give them water, which they're not getting, give them education, which they're also not getting, and all these things. But actually empowering refugees, and as we've seen all over the world, and as I'm sure you've seen through your work, refugees all over the world have given back so much to the societies and communities that they tend to join. So I think one of the needs that we see is refugees being inspired, as being empowered, and being able to give back. And I think if we started seeing the issue in that way, then a lot of the host communities would have a different type of situation. Rather than seeing them as a burden, they could actually be really capable and giving members of that society.
Sana?
I think, I don't know how much I can talk about challenges, and especially that my experience is more in Norway, but to maybe actually reflect on that, I think, speaking of refugees in Norway and how the system takes in refugees, I think there is so much reform that can actually happen in enabling people to be more able to use their own capacities, their own skills that they come with already. I know very few Syrians, again, speaking on the Syrian experience, but I know there's so many refugees from other nationalities, but because this is my experience, I know very few Syrians who were actually able to put their previous education and careers into practice in Norway. And I think this is a big question mark for the system. And we're talking about one of the richest countries in the world that was not able to be a little bit more flexible to incorporate carpenters, electricians, painters, lawyers, teachers into the workforce in the sense that would allow them to be, perform at their best capacity, because this is what they know best at. Many of them, of course, I'm not against, of course we should be required to maybe take extra education and language and all of that, but it's actually many people's careers are put into zero once they come to Norway and they have to start over. So I think, that's a big question. I mean, it's a big question, we're not going into it now, but again, seeing people, seeing their histories and not disconnecting them from what they have actually had been doing for so many years before they come to this new society.
In the morning here, I talked about how after the Second World War, the UN system was established, the international institutions, the UN Human Rights Declaration, the Refugee Convention. And there's one question here that's also got quite a bit of votes, is why don't the UN and international organizations do more?
Because they're state-centric.
Yes, exactly.
The UN is made up of states. People forget that.
Yes.
There is the executive arm, which is very good at issuing reports and raising alarms and saying this area is besieged. But then the states deliver aid until the UN deliver aid in a different area. If we're dealing with an organization that's state-centric, and then we're dealing with a proxy war like Syria where the states are not agreeing, then they are rendered useless. The political arms are rendered useless. We can keep using the executive arms, the coordination for humanitarian aid, the refugees agency to collect data, to give us the reports, credible reports that we can then, like the Commission of Inquiry, that we can then raise with the political arms in the Human Rights Council, Security Council, General Assembly, and the rest of it. But I think states, and partly our fault, have been able to hide behind international organizations. The UN is unable to do something. Great, you're a member of the UN.
Exactly.
You're supposed to be able to do something. And I think, and I tell that to UK politicians all the time, you're hiding behind the Russian veto. It makes your life easy if Russia vetoes, because that would mean you would not be able, you would not actually have to do something about it. And so most states are part of the UN. Most states have voting, almost all states have voting powers, whether in the General Assembly or the Security Council and all of that. And this is where each and every state and each and every citizen of the state need to make their states accountable within the international organization for them to work. And not to hold on to international organizations when they don't work, right? And to be honest, the UN, in a large extent, has failed in Syria. This is not something that is, scandalous to say anymore. So reform, and more involvement from states, not hiding behind this cover of international organizations.
Yeah.
No, I think Ibrahim said it all. I think we forget that the UN is made up of member states. And so I've been in rooms where, we're attacking the UN, and then the UN people are like, but we're made up of member states. So everybody bears responsibility, but there's a cycle here, and I think we need to figure out how to break it. And I think that's the main issue.
Yeah, I think building up on that, just also connecting it back to the Norwegian context, Norway is one of the largest donors to especially the Syria response, the fourth largest donor, I think. And there's so much to actually be done pressuring Norway, or not pressuring, but advocating for Norway to make sure that they're upholding as well the international law when it comes to humanitarian aid. I don't know if you remember a few years back, there was a scandal that Norwegian taxpayer money is going to a hospital that was run by ISIS or something like that. And there was a lot of follow-up actions after that. But today, I don't think many actually are following as well how the humanitarian aid could and is being manipulated by the Syrian regime, and how Norwegian taxpayer money could also be used to finance those who have been committing war crimes before. I'm not going so much into details. I know Ibrahim has done extensive research on that and all the entities that are actually working closely with the UN, because UN works a lot through partners. And of course, if you're working in government areas in Syria, you have to have a link somehow to the ruling family in order to be able to function. So I think also increasing our awareness that often it's also portrayed in Norway that the money that's going to the UN is outsourced. The risk is outsourced. We don't do a lot of checking. We don't checking after the UN, because they have a very rigid system in place. And yes, they have a very rigid bureaucracy. But again, if the political will is not there, we need to as well check what the UN is doing and hold them accountable. So it's actually our money that we are paying to the UN that we could follow up on and ensure it's living up to the international law.
I think, Maya, you gave us some understanding of the living conditions for people living as refugees in Lebanon. What can be done to improve those living conditions?
I think Maya or Ruba would be better suited to answer this, but honestly, I think that there's so much to be done when it comes to Lebanon, and I think that international organizations do not have a lot of times the access that smaller grassroots organizations like Sawa for Aid do have, and also the community presence and delivering projects and aid in a way that is sustainable, dignified, and respectful for those communities. I think one of the ways to improve those conditions is to increase support to those types of organizations who are not just giving food baskets, who are not just filling their quotas and making sure that a certain percentage of kids are in school, but making sure that the way that that is happening is done in a very respectful and sustainable way. Because I think one of the main issues you see in Lebanon is funding issues, for sure. Also access, because the government does not take responsibility for these camps and whatnot. But I think that also smaller grassroots organizations get certain levels of funding, but then that are cut off when the focus shifts or priorities shift. And I think that creates these bumps along the way. So I think having a steady stream of funding to the right people in the right places would really help increase and improve the living conditions of Syrian refugees.
In Norway and many other European countries, when this is, when migration, refugees are discussed, it's often a discussion of politicians saying, if you don't want that much migration, you say that we're going to help them where they are. How is that working?
Well, I think the first point is that refugees are being used as a commodity,
Exactly.
As a card, as a bargaining chip. I give Lebanon, a lot of regional countries, including Turkey. They're holding Europe to ransom. In the sense, I will open the floodgates, I'll send people across the sea, I'll send people back. Lebanon, on the other hand, for example, is working with this Russian deal in order to get European reconstruction funding that, look, Syrians are returning, so give us the money in order to reconstruct Syria so people can stay. Myth, a lie. That's not how it works. In a lot of cases, people say, let's give them if it was an economic issue, I would understand that. But at least in the situation inside Syria. But if it's a right-based issues and you have a corrupt financial domestic system, you're financing the reasons why these human rights abuses are taking place in the first place. And so yes, while it's important to give neighboring countries the support they need in order to be able to give them a living condition that works, it's important to not be affected, not to be held at ransom. It's important not to allow them to manipulate the facts, the numbers, to be able to say, no, I will need 10 times this number, and to make sure that the money is actually going to the people that kind of need it and not used by corrupt politicians. And when you think of it, and that's something that money cannot do, what Maya was talking about, legal status is a human right. It's the same thing like the right to food and right to water. You cannot access hospital, education, get your food items without being registered and have some paperwork. And that's something Norwegian money cannot buy in Lebanon. It can probably have influence on Lebanon, which it should use. But then again, if people leave these countries because they're technically invisible, then they should not be blamed for leaving. And taking into account, and it was so hilarious when we've seen these reports when the migration crisis had. And one reporter said, "I found a refugee with an iPhone." Of course, you'll find a refugee with an iPhone because we're not fleeing. Most of us are not fleeing an economic situation that can be solved with money. It's persecution and war and human rights. And if your money can buy that, great. But I'm not sure it can.
Thank you. We are moving towards the end of this panel discussion, but I just wanted to add a question which is not on the poll, and that relates to what's happening in Lebanon just now. We've seen 1/5, 1/4 of the population out in the streets demonstrating. We've seen the government now saying that they will resign. Do you have any idea what will happen from here? How will this also impact people from Syria living in Lebanon?
I think it's a very important question, and I think it's something we discuss amongst ourselves and with our Lebanese friends, and then a lot of times me as somebody I call myself the daughter of the Syrian revolution, of course I stand with the Lebanese revolution. And sometimes people will tell me, but it's not your fight. And I think that we've seen very clearly that it is our fight, and that we need to stop thinking about, especially our region, as these borders and what happens there doesn't affect us, because as we've clearly seen, what happened in Syria is affecting what is happening in Lebanon. And what is happening in Lebanon will clearly affect what is happening, one, in Syria, of course, because if Hezbollah loses some power, that will also be a big, let's hope. But also, with so many Syrian refugees living in Lebanon, it's undoubted that if the conditions of Lebanese everyday daily lives improve, then that will definitely improve the lives of Syrian people. Also, I think we think of Lebanese and Lebanon as having been very unwelcoming to Syrians over the past few years. And I always say that, of course, I hate it, but also I don't want us to forget that there is a long history between Syria and Lebanon. And also, I don't think anybody is born a racist. I think that's a product of your environment, of the system you come from, of the politics around you. And I think that if in these moments we're able to break these boundaries and for us to be unified and stand together, I think that's a very important step for Syrians and Lebanese as communities.
And if I can pick up on that, what I found inspiring from the videos and the chants that I've seen is that there are a lot of people that recognize that their economic situation is not as a result of refugees. It's a result of corrupt politicians who steal the country, including money that was supposed to go to refugees. And when we're seeing Chance saying, you know, refugees are welcome in such an uprising where the government has tried to blame refugees for every single failure of their own, that's a message of hope. That is a message, you know, that the people are waking up and recognizing, you know, that Syrians are not the kind of community that would burden the economy. They're there because a lot of those who are in Lebanon cannot return because Hezbollah, a political power in Lebanon, is occupying their houses in Syria. So they technically cannot return. Hezbollah is militarily active in west and the southwest of Syria. So I think that there is a lot that could happen out of it. And just to you know, pick up on what Nosha said, it's a very fine line between saying, you know, state sovereignty and the people choose. But then once the people make a choice, then it's our choice whether to side by them or not. Yes. You know, we suffered this in Syria where people said, you know, this is an internal affair. Great, internal affair. Listen to what the internal people want, and then take a side that is not with the perpetrator, but with the victims and those who want to stand up for their rights. So I do not think, you know, think that Lebanon can be seen in abstract from Syria or Turkey or Iraq or Palestine or any other country in the Middle East. And as we've seen, what happened in one country, in Syria, affected almost every country in the world with this whole refugee crisis. So this is an opportunity for all of us to get involved, knowing our stuff, getting, you know, managing the knowledge that we're getting, and getting in line in solidarity behind people that are calling for their rights.
Ibrahim.
Why do you keep clapping for him?
I don't know.
Ibrahim, Nusha, Zainal, thank you very much for sharing and contributing.
One more time? Thank you.